We're going to be looking at chapter 7 today. I did a recording over chapter 6. I was able to get that done yesterday. I did have internet earlier in the day, and so I was able to get that recorded. I ran through chapter 6 fairly quickly. I think the video was about 45 minutes or so. I didn't cover everything as fully as I would have liked, but I wasn't certain how long the power and the internet connections were all going to stay with me. And so I tried to go through as much as I could, give you some details. So we're going to be looking at chapter 7 today. This is an extension. Really, chapter 6 and 7 go together, talking about the biblical tradition. Chapter 6, the rise of Christianity, early Christianity, and then now in chapter 7, the movement of Christianity becoming a very political as well as religious force. So that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be talking about some of the key people, the art, the architecture that stems as Christianity becomes more dominant. So we're going to be looking at all those. So I'm going to share the screen. And what hopefully you're seeing right now is the preview. Again, they did this with chapter 6 also. They give you this artwork here. This is Augustine in his study, but this is not from the time period we're looking at. This is from 1480, Botticelli, who will paint both religious and other style paintings when we get to the Renaissance. So this sort of anticipates a little bit. But the subject of this painting, Augustine, is important during this time. Augustine of Hippo, as he's mentioned here in your book, the first medieval man, the last classical man. He's going to be one of those influential figures during this time. He, as it says here, was born and died in North Africa, but he did spend time in Milan where he encountered Ambrose. We'll be talking about him in a moment. And then also in Rome. One of the interesting aspects about Augustine is that his mother was a devout Christian and constantly was praying for her son. His father, though, was a pagan, and Augustine, in his early years, says up till he was 33, essentially led a non-Christian life. He was very intellectual. He was highly skilled, highly talented in that way. And it was not until really his encounter with Ambrose and his mother's constant prayers that Augustine becomes converted to Christianity. So we're going to talk about him a little bit as well. And so it just gives you the details about this painting, which we will get to later when we get to the Renaissance. Now it's hopefully moving there. There we go. As I mentioned last time, if you listen to the video over chapter 6 from yesterday, toward the end of the 3rd century, the 200s, Christianity had already started taking on a fairly prominent political situation and status. Excuse me. Excuse me again. It was in the early 4th century, though, that we have Constantine taking over as emperor and eventually allowing for Christianity to be tolerated. And also it's Constantine who will adopt Christianity as the state religion of his new empire. What occurs is that during the different aspects of the Roman Empire, we start having Rome being abandoned in the sense of many of the wealthy people moved out. They moved to the coast, they moved up to the mountains, or they left Italy, as we would call it now. They left it totally. You had one particular emperor who built his palace over in what we now think of as the Balkans, Albania. When Constantine does become the emperor, he leaves Rome and establishes a new city, which he has built and calls it Constantinople, basically the city of Constantine. It is now what we call modern day Istanbul. And he essentially sets up his Roman Empire here. the Senate still meets in Rome, but it's under the authority of Constantine, who's living in what we now think of as modern-day Turkey. This creates some of the problems, some of the issues. You start having sort of this separation, and eventually that separation is going to get even more dramatic as we see changes occurring. As it mentions here, he changes it from Byzantium to Constantinople, builds quite a bit to it. He's spending less and less time in Rome. When there are issues, eventually, and you have other emperors who come along, Honorius, it mentions, goes up to Ravenna and sets up his capital there. The Goths come in and sack Rome, but they don't stay in Rome. They go up and stay in Ravenna, in fact. So Rome is sort of in decline during this time. It's really not a very nice place to live. As I said, many of the wealthy people have moved out to the coastal areas, have moved over into this area of, I guess I should make it bigger for you, to this area along the Adriatic. So Rome becomes essentially a place where the Senate would meet, but quite often it was just left to a very poor population. What we would consider homeless people were living there. As we move through, one of the major aspects that does occur is Constantine, when he does become a Christian, he is being told different views about Christianity to the point where he says, wait a minute, which way am I supposed to believe? Because he had different authorities, quote unquote, offering him advice. What he does is set up the Nicene Council in Nicaea. And I think it was over on the map over here. Let me see. Yes, here's Nicaea, just south of Constantinople. And he sets up a council. He calls all the religious leaders together, puts them together in this meeting. And this is why sometimes you might think that the early followers of Christianity were really very Baptist in their organization. Because one of the first things they did is call a committee meeting. And so this committee meets, and not only that, it meets for like 45 years off and on before they make any decisions. It's really not confirmed under Constantine. It's going to be much later. But what he wants is standards. He wants to know, what am I, as a new Christian, to believe? What can we tell others? And it says here, he wanted order. He found conflict between Christian groups who held different beliefs. So, as it says here, the bishop one city attacked the bishop of another. You had all these different views. So he calls for this council. He says, you need to reach this view. You have the Arian controversy. You have the Orthodox Christians, named after Alexander. Jesus is divine, part of the Godhead. Arius, the Arian view that Jesus was created son, so he's distinct from God the Father. There's an argument back and forth. And so Constantine didn't support the Arian view, but he wanted a decision to be reached. And so he calls the Nicene Council together. They are to come up with a code. They are to get it written down. It goes off and on for a while. As it says here, he locked them up as it says here, not to merge till these key matters have been put to rest. Well, it doesn't happen too well. So eventually Theodosius has to have the council reconvene. And when the Nicene Council finally reaches a decision, it's called the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is going to state certain beliefs, and we're going to get to it in just a moment. Among the early influencers of the church's views and beliefs, besides the ones we just mentioned about Alexander and Arius, you have four major figures, the four key fathers of the church. And when we talk about the church, we're really talking about the Catholic Church, because at this time, there's only one religion. It's the religion of Rome, where it was established. It was the quote unquote the church. The word Catholic with a lower C means universal. And so these are the four uh, fathers of this church. Ambrose, I mentioned him earlier. Augustine, I mentioned him. And then two others, St. Jerome and Pope Gregory. And you'll see that all these are in the fourth, fifth, and into the sixth century. Gregory makes it barely into the seventh. But we're talking from the 300s to the 500s. And they're going to have the influence on both beliefs, philosophy, and culture of the development of this religion that is now called Christianity. Ambrose is one of those interesting figures. He was from Gaul, basically modern day Germany. His father was a political governor in that area. The story goes, it mentions here, that when he was just a baby, that a swarm of bees came and put drops of honey on his face, so that his father was certain that his son would be a great, great man. He did become important. He left Gaul and went to Milan, in what we now think was modern day Italy, rose to prominence there. When the Bishop of Milan died, he attended the meeting to try and make sure everything was organized and orderly. But during that meeting, he was proposed as the new Bishop of Milan. He didn't feel worthy. In fact, he ran away from the meeting and hid himself. But a friend of his revealed where Ambrose was hiding. He was brought back to the meeting, and he told that he didn't feel he could because he had never been baptized. He was not educated in theology. He had been educated in rhetoric and other areas, but not as a theologian. He didn't have the background about the Christianity itself. His objections were overruled. He was baptized and ordained immediately and then made the Bishop of Milan. It's in that position that he's going to become this key figure of the early church. He throws himself into studying the theology and the views, the religious ideas. One of his major views, and that still impacts the church today, the Catholic Church today, is his view about Mary, the mother of Jesus. That she was a virgin when she gave birth was something he embraced and taught, founding it in the scriptures, that since she was the mother of God, Jesus, she was a vital figure for the church, what she represented. And to this day, Mary is still a key figure in the Catholic Church. As it says here, he supported the view that Christ was one person, not two. There were views among the Arians, for instance, that Jesus was a human, and then upon his crucifixion, then his spirit became God. Others that he was never a human, he was only a spirit who just looked like a God. There were all sorts of different views. And Ambrose was the one who was early refused to go with any other views, but talked about God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit. It's three in one, one in three, and that Jesus was God, both man and God at the same time. And so he wrote about these. He wrote about what faith involved. He wrote about the early leaders of the founders of the Hebraic faith, Abraham, Noah, etc. He wrote hymns. He wrote political, basically, commentaries, advising the emperors what they needed to be doing. He had at times Milan was besieged, and he refused to surrender it. Again, remember, Italy was not a unified country, but essentially city-states that ruled in and of themselves. And so when the emperor commanded that Milan surrender itself and that the church at Milan be given over to the emperor, Ambrose refused. He had to negotiate quite a bit, um, and eventually, one of his major aspects was that he, upon becoming Bishop Milan, he had donated money to the poor. Um, Augustine, coming out of North Africa, had gone to school in Rome and then up to school in Milan, and that's where he was inspired by the preaching and the teaching of Ambrose. He was converted and baptized, and eventually Augustine became the Bishop of Hippo, going back to North Africa. He died, Ambrose died a natural death. Um, and even today, his body is still in a crypt in Milan in the basilica named after him. Now, Ambrose was an individual. He has some very strong, your book calls it disdain for pagans and Jews. He had very strong views. He felt that Christianity was the religion, that those who failed to follow it were doomed to hell. As I mentioned earlier, he did write about faith and what that involved. And he felt that it was the duty of the Christian to convert those who were, as it puts in your book, pagans and Jews. They need to be converted, and those who refuse to be converted were doomed. It's a little iffy with some of his views, but he was staunch in his theological stance and influenced the stance of many others later. Next figure that's mentioned in your book is all about Augustine. As mentioned earlier, Augustine becomes a major philosopher. He's one of the few and true Christian philosophers. He was born in North Africa, one of the Roman colonies. His father was a pagan. His mother was, as it puts here, about Roman Catholic. Well, there was no Roman Catholic at the time, it was just Catholic. She was a devout Christian. And her son, though, was raised in a pagan atmosphere, pagan school. He was highly intellectual, and as such, he was sent to school, studied in Carthage, moved on, as I said, to Rome and then to Milan. He would later write his Confessions, basically a biography or autobiography, in which he talked about his life prior to being a Christian. And Augustine, as it says here, a cauldron of illicit loves leapt and boiled about him. He lived a life of hedonistic pursuit. He drank and caroused and just focused on earthly pleasures and also his education. He was, again, a scholarly individual. But he supported or was following the polytheistic views from the Persian views of Manichaean. And he, as it says here, lived that hedonistic lifestyle. He said, I was not yet in love, but I loved the idea of love. He took a mistress, they call her a concubine here. And it says it was a sweet thing to be loved, and sweeter still when I was able to enjoy the body of a woman. That's basically how he lived the first 30 plus years of his life. He lived with his mistress for 13 years, did not marry her because of the idea about the marriage between different classes. Roman law kept that apart. If you'll remember, the wife of Augustus, Caesar Augustus, had influenced a number of different laws about marriage. It was Augustus himself had instituted laws where young men were supposed to marry at a certain age, but you had to marry within your class, your consideration. Nobles and freed people could not marry slaves. So Augustine never married his mistress. They did have a child. Since it was not really, there was no common law marriage recognized at that time. And so he moved to Rome, studied there, then to Milan, and that's when he met Ambrose and was so impressed with the teaching of Ambrose and his preaching that he converted, which pleased Augustine's mother to no end. She'd been praying for her son's conversion for literally since the time he was a youth. So over 20 years, she had been praying for this. As we're trying to get somebody to come in. So he writes his confessions eventually, which he didn't hesitate to reveal what he had been like earlier, but also how he became once he was converted. He became a priest, was elected as a bishop in Hippo back in North Africa. He becomes one of the leading figures, as we mentioned earlier, in the early Christian church in the 4th century. He writes his confessions and will later write City of God, in which he explains how the world needs to emulate what God wants it to be. And so he writes the City of God, in which he talks about, as it says here, the concept of the church, what the church needs to establish itself as being, and needs to follow what God has laid out. And it says here, City of God is distinct from the flawed city of man, and that the City of God, the church needs to reform itself to a certain extent, needs to conform itself to what God expects. And his views and philosophic concepts are really important during this time. He influences others later. He's going to influence a number of these. And he eventually, of course, becomes St. Augustine. He is named as a saint of the Catholic Church. Thomas Aquinas comes along later. Other, as it mentions here, Christian theologians in the medieval 1100, 1200, 1300s are all going to be influenced by what Augustine has written. And it's even going to influence others, including Martin Luther and John Calvin, when we get to the Reformation. Another key aspect, as I mentioned about the confessions, and I talked a little bit about that one, he writes in these about his life, very self-reflective, as your book puts it here. He talks about his development, both as a scholar, but also as a spiritual individual. The conversion to Christianity becomes important to him and fills parts of this, in which he describes the details of his conversion. And you have an excerpt here. Says it's a meditation on the grace of God in Augustine's life to help shape him into what he's going to be. That he had been so caught up in the material, hedonistic ways of the world that he had almost lost connection with his spiritual, but God saves him from that and brings him on. And so, as it says here, it creates some of these key details, excuse me for that appearing, and creates some of the key details of this. And this idea that that man can be saved is one of the key parts that Augustine writes. In City of God, for instance, as it puts it here, he is rejecting that history has to repeat itself, that instead the City of God can be saved, will be saved, that if the church would focus on what God wanted, the world could become a better place and would be more of what God expected. As it says here, it says time exists in the mind, there's only the present, the past is a memory, the future is an expectation. And so this is something that he writes about. As he says here, there's the human society, this idea about what it can be. It says the diversity of language separates man from man. It says if two men meet and are forced by compelling reason not to pass on but to stay in company, then if neither knows the other's language, it's easier for dumb animals to associate together. And that this separation is not what man needs, that we need to find a commonality, that we need to search for that commonality, and that where we can find it is in our common beliefs, religion, and that is what should be important. and that peace should be the instinctive aim. That is what we need. Peace is the desired end. If we can overlook the differences, if we can learn to quote unquote speak the same language, we can achieve peace. And it's an interesting views and concept. I mentioned some here about he warns against taking the Bible literally if it flies in the face of reason. And he talks a little bit about that. He says he understands the Bible was written as it was because it must be said but that our authors knew the truth about the nature of skies. It was not the intention of the Spirit of God who spoke through them to teach man anything that would not be of use to them for their salvation. And so he has some of these views that some argue against, some argue to support. He continued to talk about original sin, and that, as he says, he believes that the sexual act is not evil, but it's the lust that accompanies it that is wrong. Moving on, we have other details. Augustine, of course, is going to inspire a number of different works. This is of Galileo. It says here, one of the reasons here that this painting is that he was charged with heresy for his heliocentric views, the sun at the center, because it counters what was being taught by the church. And so it's going to be a number of issues that, this concept, as he says here, his cautionary words to resist making scientific issues into issues of faith. That was one of the warnings of Augustine, but the church did not follow. And as such, Galileo, offering his scientific views, gets punished by the church. And we'll consider more about Galileo much later as we go to different chapters. Another one of the influential figures during this era is Boethius. I'll get it pronounced here. Who served Theodoric. Now, Theodoric is the Goth king who came in, sacked Rome, and established a kingdom in Ravenna. So Boethius, as he's called, you can see the full name here, Ancius Manelius Severnius Boethius. Luckily, we just call him Boethius. He comes in and as a philosopher tries to reconcile views. So he writes Constellation Philosophy, where he has lady philosophy in a debate, a discussion. It's set up as a dialogue, similar to Socratic dialogues, so that issues can be worked out. It says here, it sort of takes some of the spiritual aspects of Job, not quite the actual Job, but some of the views of Job that emerge. And again, I talked about that in chapter 6. And the Stoicism, this idea of Job, that one of the comments is that God gives, God can take away. And so the Stoic attitude, which we talked about in chapter 4, is that you're just supposed to essentially bear what happens in the world. You can't change it. Learn to accept what happens. So we have here Lady Philosophy talking to literally Boethius, a character that he creates, the author speaking. Don't pity yourself. Don't complain about your situation. Face your troubles. Know that God is provident, that God is going to be there taking care of you through all this evil, all the problems you may see, that God will be there for you, that human freedom exists along with an all-knowing God, and that good will eventually triumph. And it becomes a key aspect that we see, this idea about the Christian enduring. Again, it's some of the reflections are from the writings of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where he talks about love endures all things. This is part of what Boethius is looking at, this idea about the Christian, even when matters are going against you, should be able to endure. Trust in God. He will get you through it. And so it becomes a key aspect, as it says here, the teaching of Boethius, talking about free will, the nature of God, is all an important aspect that's going to influence how the church is going to be presented. We go on, and we have Ravenna. As I mentioned, Ravenna becomes the center of the, when Theodore, the Goth king, established himself literally as king of Italy. It's the first time that Italy is declared. He's up in the north in Ravenna. And it's going to be at this time that eventually the later Emperor Justinian is going to come over, and they're going to build a basilica, a church, cathedral there in Ravenna. This is the mausoleum of Galla Placidia, as it tells you, early church. It has sunk, in case you can't tell. This area here, these were originally windows, but the church itself was built on very marshy ground and has sunk. I think your book says about 3 feet. Let's see if that's right. Yeah, it's sunk more than 3 feet, so that has literally this part would have been up 3 feet. So you would have had a base, and then these areas here were actually windows. They had to brick them up later because the sinking caused problems of glass breaking, flooding into the church. So they sealed that all up. But this is the Church of Ravenna, and you can see that there's a certain style to it. The curving archways here were very Roman in that way. As I mentioned in chapter 6, the discussion I posted yesterday, the interior of the church was in the shape of the cross, where you have the long aisle and then you have the altar. And so that's part of what we have. And so we have this detail, and you can sort of tell this here, the shape of the cross on the outside. Moving on, give it a moment. What they also did, this is part of the mausoleum there in Ravenna, the decorations. These are mosaics, very much in the light of what we had seen in Rome, where they had the mosaics on the floor and on the walls, and the frescoes painted on the walls. They continued that with the churches, and this one is a mosaic. Again, as I mentioned about chapter 6, Christ was often presented as the Good Shepherd. Early in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the 100s and 200s, it was a presentation so that Christians could identify each other. When Christianity became, again, legalized, if you will, by Constantine, then became the state religion, there was no need to be covert about it. So you have the overt displays here within the churches of Christ as a good shepherd. Now, some people worry about these not really looking so much like sheep, especially with the tails, but this is what we see. And this is a mosaic where you have the detailing of the tiling to create the impression and the image. And you see these are supposed to represent the constellation and the stars, but the ornamental style and details that you can see here are all part of what we're going to see, and they're going to be maintained with what we call the Byzantine style over in the East, in Constantinople especially. As it calls here, a Persian rug motif, supposed to be, as I said, the constellation of the stars. This becomes a very common art style that we're going to start seeing. Again, highly decorated. This is also in Ravenna, another church, again, because Ravenna was a capital, a major city. You had multiple churches in this area. This is for Saint Apollinaire, and built in the 5th century, again in Ravenna. And you see the elaborate ceilings, how the detailing here is put in the coffering aspects with the 3-dimensional ornamentation. You see how the windows, again, using the Roman arches to create a sense of light flowing into this area. Here's your altar, the aisle coming down, the use of the columns. These are actually Corinthian columns, where you have the ornamental base and the very ornamental upper part and support. Again, you can see how this becomes a common design for the churches of this era. It's going to be very decorated. What we have here also, eventually, you're going to have, again, more of these mosaics and windows. Eventually, you're going to have the use of stained glass. That's going to become very important. And so you have no blue, but heavenly gold. Again, this is representative of Christ. One of the key aspects of recognizing the figure of Christ and then the other saints are going to be this area right back here. This becomes the halo. And you're going to start seeing these little arches behind the heads of those who are considered saints. and especially behind the head of any figure of Christ, because that's going to show the holy state and quality of the figure. Theodoric, as it says, executed Boethus. He was buried in a mausoleum, and eventually this mausoleum is what we're looking at becomes, the Church of the Redeemer, as it was first called in Saint Apollinaire. And you have the details here about this one, the different mosaics that are offered, and how it, as it says here, themes of early Christian iconography is part of the idea about how the images are going to be presented for us. And it becomes really much a part of what is going to be what we call Byzantine, which is going to be very lush and reverent in tone and style. Moving on, talks about divine right, and what we eventually is going to be called the Byzantine Empire. Byzantium was named the city that was redone under Constantine, was named Constantinople. Eventually, when this region falls to the Ottomans, the name is restored as Byzantium, and then eventually the name in modern times is made as Istanbul. What we do have is that the emperor is going to rule, and he's going to be in charge. And so you have this aspect that's going to be presented, this idea of the power of the emperor being civil and religious, both. As I said, you had Constantine, who became a Christian, authorized and essentially told the church what it needed to be doing. So the church was actually a part of the state. Justinian is going to come along later, and he's also going to be really important with the church. The Pope is going to come along. You do have the Pope established in the late 300s into the 400s. But even the Pope is going to be answering to the emperor for some time. And it talks about this aspect here about the Byzantine Empire. So you have this combination of church and state. They're not really separated. So Byzantium was probably founded in the 7th century BCE. As it says here, probably King Nisos, a Greek king, his son Bezus set up his own city. Again, it's not quite accurate in the sense of, do we know this for certain? No, but it's a good story. Constantine renames it Constantinople and redoes parts of it. When it falls, of course, it's going to be called Byzantium. So the Eastern Roman Empire becomes known as the Byzantium Empire. What we do have is a whole style. Constantinople is, as it says here, eventually going to be reestablished under Justinian, takes over in the 6th century, 200 years after Constantine. One of the problems is that there was a breach between the two sides, the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire. Rome said it was the center because it's Rome, and therefore the Roman Empire should be centered there. But of course, the emperors had been over in Constantinople, and so the authorities of Constantinople said, no, we're the authority, and for you have split. Eventually, Justinian goes to war against the forces that were in charge of the area that we think of as Italy, defeats them, builds a new church in Ravenna to honor his win, thanks to God, and then he goes back to Constantinople. But it stops that split for a little while, but split's going to take place, and eventually the two empires are separated. You have the Byzantium Empire and the Roman Empire. They're going to be separated. One of the influences on Justinian was his wife, Theodora. As it says here, she was a former dancer and prostitute. That's where he met her. He marries her, and she becomes highly political in the sense of she's going to be a major influence. One of the key aspects of Constantinople early in Justinian's reign is that Constantinople had also fallen into a really problematic city. there were a number of gangs, as we would probably call them, that were operating in certain regions of the city. Literally, they were under the control of gangs, and you only had parts of it where the emperor had full authority. Um, Theodora supposedly chided Justinian for not being emperor of his own city, and eventually Justinian, using military, uh, started waging war against the gangs, was able to defeat some of them, but others were very strong. They had really, a large number of forces. What Justinian wound up doing was going in and talking with the leaders of the different areas of the city, what we would now call precincts in a larger city, and he negotiated with them. He told them, listen, uh, you need to keep control of this area. You don't want other leaders coming in and attacking you. So what you need to do is patrol your area. But here's what I'll do: you're all going to answer to me, but I'll pay you. And he literally paid them to control their area, but report to him. So it was like individual police precincts were set up, and he was able to establish imperial control over all of Constantinople. It's also supposed to be Theodora who pushed him about being in control of the Roman Empire, and that pushed him to actually try to take over. One of the key aspects of Justinian was that he almost fled Constantinople because, as I said, he was trying to control it and had war against Arian. And at one time, it wasn't looking good, and he had a ship in the harbor ready for him to sail away. And Theodora talked him out of it, telling him that no, you can't leave. This is your city. You're the emperor. Take charge. And eventually, the plan that I just talked about came about. As it says here, trade was really important. Trading with the East, the Middle East, was vital. The silk industry, the Silk Road, was important. As it says here, he took the Roman law and really revised it. He spent a great deal of time once he was able to establish control throughout, redoing much of what the early Romans had done, building roads, creating strong infrastructure, sewer systems, building monasteries so that people could be trained in the teachings of the church. Nunneries were built. He really emphasized scholarship, as it mentions here. He had a legal scholar produce order and codes. Hadrian Code that Emperor Hadrian had tried to establish, but now gets further written and established and developed, so that you have criminal law and civil law broken out. Says here they were very passionate Christians, and they really were. In fact, after his win in Italy, he had a church commissioned to be built, a cathedral, and within that church, and we'll see that here in a little bit, there are mosaics honoring both Justinian and Theodora on opposite sides of the wall. The Hagia Sophia was built, and it is a magnificent structure. Eventually, though, it was turned into a mosque and then a museum. And today it's still a museum it is an Islamic mosque, though, on certain high occasions. As I mentioned, he had tried to establish control within Constantinople, but there were problems. As I said, he almost ran off. He was going to get into the ship to sail off, but Theodora convinced him otherwise. And you had the political leaders, those who were against each other, the Greens and the Blues, as it's mentioned here. They took their oppositions to one another to the sporting events in the hippodrome, the horse races, the chariot races that were held. And, this view that the Orthodox view Christ was both human and divine. The Monophysites said that he couldn't be both, he had to be one or the other. The Blues, the Orthodox, were wealthy. The party of the people were the Greens. So you had this huge situation. And so what took place was, says here, 30,000 people, Greens and Blues, during this times of Nike riot, that took that there was taxes on every way. And so what occurred, there have been fighting throughout. Again, Justinian had his military was besieged at different places. And so Greens and Blues were against Justinian. And so the Hippodrome, the riot broke out. You have rioting in the streets. You have the burning of the city, different areas. And so Hypatius was brought in and put on a throne at the Hippodrome to announce that they were going to overthrow Justinian and put a new emperor on the throne. As it says here, that's when Justinian was just about ready to leave, flee. He had a ship ready, but Theodora convinced him otherwise. And what they did, a little tough. They had the Greens and the Blues were there. Justinian's imperial army surrounded the Hippodrome, blocked all the exits, and then his general, Belisarius, came in with a large force, and every single one of the people in the Hippodrome were killed. As it says earlier, over 30,000. They were all killed. It didn't matter if you were a green, didn't care if you were a blue. You're all dying. And they literally slaughtered all these people, most of whom did not have weapons with them. They were at a sporting event. They hadn't brought their swords. And so they were killed. It didn't matter if they were armed or not. They were all executed, if you will. And as such, the leaders of this potential rebellion were done away with. Justinian was able to establish his control. He then had his deals with the different gang leaders in the different regions, and he was able then to take control of this city. It also, as it says here, ended chariot racing. Hippodrome was no longer used. Nobody would go to the Hippodrome anymore for chariot races, horse races, because they were worried that they would be killed if they did. Theodora, you have details about her, and she's an interesting figure. As it says here, she worked in a brothel when she was probably about 12 or so, is the estimation. As it says here, theatrical skills, sexual services, but eventually she gets married to Justinian and rises to authority and is highly influential. Talking about the power behind the throne, she was it. This is an image of the actress Sarah Bernhardt from the 19th century. There was a play written about Theodora, and she was a famous actress who took on that role. Moving on now. What we're going to see is a little bit more about the architectural style. If you'll see the barrel vault, the groin vault from Roman aspects are brought, along with this oculus, the doming effect here. This is going to get used. And the Hagia Sophia, and this is an image of it, makes use of these traditions. Now, the original building did not include these minarets. Those were added later. The original building was here. But you can see the use of the arches. I'll get that a little bit bigger. Use of the arches, common from Rome, but then the doming effect, that oculus that you see with the Pantheon. And the size of it is a huge structure, in case you can't tell the difference. Let me get down here a little bit. These are cars, and you can see just how large it is compared to that vehicle. It was an immense undertaking. It was originally, as I said, a church. When the Ottomans take over, it becomes an Islamic mosque, and that's when the minarets on each of the corners are built. It became a museum. Hagia Sophia is Greek for high wisdom. They call it holy wisdom, either way. Justinian built this church, and it was in 5 years built. And it says here is architectural achievement because you have the basilica, common in Rome, the dome central plan that you see in other areas. that Constantine had used at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If you go back to comments about chapter 6, I mentioned that one. And so we have this built here, that dome building, such as the Pantheon, is used. You have two half domes. You'll see here and here what they're talking about when they say the half domes. You have windows put in place. This idea of, as it says, column side aisles, reducing the weight so that you have these columns on the inside of it. And again, this is what we see here on the inside of it. You see these arches here are allowed to take some of the weight of the dome and then transfer that weight down. You can see the building of the columns. Again, you can see the Islamic, Arabic writings here. They're now part of this. This is, as I said, it has become a museum. So people who are not Muslim are allowed to enter it. But you can see the ornamentation. You can see just the scope and the size of this structure as it was built. Some of the aspects that were part of it were frescoes and paintings, murals of biblical stories. Those were painted over. They weren't destroyed. They were painted over when the Muslims instituted this as a mosque. But some of them have been restored because although they don't like icons, Muslims do appreciate fine art. And so they didn't destroy them. Some of them were painted over, but in recent years, some of them have been revealed because of the artistic quality. It talks about some of this aspect about the light coming through and pouring in, because again, light is supposed to represent wisdom. Suffusion of light was the element that illuminated it, but also allowed for the light of God to come in and touch those who were there in worship. It talks about worship within the Hagia Sophia. Gives you some of the details here. Idea about what was supposed to be part of it. The mosaics were added, as I mentioned earlier. It was turned into a mosque after, and they were whitewashed or plastered over, because Quran says no images. It was converted to a museum. Some of these were revealed, so you can see them. As I said, the Muslims, when they converted to a mosque, didn't destroy them. They just whitewashed. They just plastered over them. But when it was made to a museum, they did go back through and reveal some of those, because again, the art itself was prized, not the story that the art was trying to express, but the art itself was prized. And again, moving through, they give some other details. Procopius, historian, writing about some of the details, the early building of the church. You'll see that some of the concepts that he did, he praised Justinian for building the Hagia Sophia, but he was not really happy about Justinian and Theodora because, of course, of her background and some of the steps that Justinian took. As it says here, his secret history, as it's called, would be NC 17, because he took some time to describe about their relationship. Again, a little revealing, but again, he praises about the idea about the Hagia Sophia and what it's like, and you can read the details here, how this structure was viewed by one who saw it being built and saw it as its breadth and its length are so carefully proportioned, it may not probably be said to be exceedingly long at the same time unusually broad. It exalts in indescribable beauty, and that was reaction, and still is today, of this building that goes back to the 500s. That was not the only church built. Other churches were built as well in different areas and close to the Hagia Sophia. It says in all, Justinian built more than 25 churches and convents in and around Constantinople. As I said, he was trying to create this view, and he also commissioned other convents and monasteries to be built elsewhere throughout the empire. Bear with us, it takes a little while to call this up. Here it comes, maybe. Okay, it seems to have frozen a little bit. There you go. Takes a little while. Well, no, it went too far. Here we go. Let's go back one. It clicked it twice, I guess. What we have, as I said earlier, was Justinian to commemorate the consolidation, if you will, of Italy, as we would call it now, and Constantinople, is this church of St. Vitali. It's dedicated to Justinian. And as it says here, year Justinian came to the throne while the gospel ruled Ravenna. It had been begun, but then Justinian funds it, and you have this church as being built. You can see again the use of the doming effect, the use of the rounded windows throughout. As I said earlier, that Justinian, once he is established and connects the two, this is what we wind up having is again the mosaic in St. Vitali, named after St. Vitellius. This is, of course, again, if you can make out, there's the halo. This is Jesus enthroned. He's the Lord of the world, so he sits on it. And then you have flanked by angels. We know they're angels, they're holy. They have the little glow behind them as well. And then you have the saints as well. Again, you have the heavens. You have the details up here as well. See the ornamentation, the idea about the bounty of the earth and the fertility of the earth and the glorious plants that are there. And then you have the further details. And on this side, this is Theodora. And on this side, this is Justinian. And so you have the emperor on one side and the empress on the other. And you have close-ups of those also here. And so Justinian is also being depicted as a holy person because, look, he's not only wearing a crown, but he has a halo behind him. Theodora is presented in a similar fashion. She is not only the empress with the crown, you see that, but there's the glow behind her, so that we also see that she should be regarded as a holy individual. As it says here, what we have here are the mosaics, the details. Christ as the one who sustains all things, the one who's the leader. And one of the key aspects, if you'll notice, and so far we've seen this in a previous mosaic, the Good Shepherd, and now we see it in this one. Notice that Christ is presented as a fair-skinned young man with no beard. The image of Christ as a bearded figure, which probably is more common, that you may be more common in seeing, comes along later, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is the image of Jesus early, as a fair-skinned young man without the beard. As it says here, the church, here's the model of the church being offered to Christ by the bishop, Ecclesias, who was one who helped start the founding of the building of the church there at Ravenna. You have Michael and Gabriel, the two named angels from the Bible, are there flanking Christ. You have the details offered there. And again, this whole concept being part of early Christian art, how it's going to be presented, the detailing here of those who are there. Theodora has the Magi bring the gift of Christ on her gown at the bottom here, in case you can't tell that. Let's show you this one. That's this right down here. The images of the ladies in waiting and the other attendants that Theodora has. This is all part that we see as early Christian art, where we see these details offered. Her close friends are part of it. I mean, they're all put into this. Some are stereotyped, they all look the same, but others are given individualism. This is the Bishop's Throne Cathedral that's offered, so that this was where we would have The carving, elaborate carving, again, you can see that. You have, as it says here at the front, you have John the Baptist, the four evangelists around. So you have literally these details here. John the Baptist here, then Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John offered in this way. And it's elaborate carving that we're going to see in detailing of art. That's going to be part of this Christian style that is going to be really influential on art and development in other areas. Now, as I mentioned, Justinian commissioned other areas to be built. This is St. Catherine's Monastery that Justinian had founded. And in this one, what he does, he wants these institutes, these monasteries, to become centers of learning, educating the next generation of those who are going to be the teachers. And this is what we see with St. Catherine's, which literally is at the base of Mount Sinai. And for those of you who are familiar with the Old Testament, you know that Mount Sinai, this is the area where Moses was, decided about the burning bush. Well, this is supposed to be in that same area. This is a monastery that was built. It is still there today. It has withstood a number of sieges. You can see it's been expanded over the years. This is the central part that was originally built, but it's been expanded over the years. You can see it goes on in that direction off to the right of the screen here. But what we have is built essentially on in an oasis area. You can see the trees, it's self-supporting, but it's literally out in the Sinai Desert. As it mentions here, you have these details where this is a monastery fortress. It's supposed to be built on the side of the burning bush where God spoke to Moses. You have this formal name is the Monastery of the Transfiguration. And you have the details here that it's offered. It's within the monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery, that a number of religious works were found. The Codex, as it mentions here, the New Testament, one of the earliest writings there, where we have the details found in the 1800s when a German was visiting, and he asked to borrow it for a short time, and the monks allowed him to look at it, and so then he left and took it with him. Eventually, it was sold, we believe, to the Soviet, into the Tsar of Russia. They say it was given here, probably not, it's probably sold, and then eventually the Soviet government, which had it, sold to the British Museum, who still have it. But what we have is an early version of the New Testament, one of the earliest versions that allow for the details. Stephanos was the architect that was found. There have been, as it says here, inscriptions have been found as it's gone through a number of renovations recently and updating, trying to preserve it, preservation attempts, and they've been finding inscriptions, people who've written on the trusses, who was there, the name of the architect. All this is part of this, and so it's an important site for architecture, historical, and for religious reasons. And one of the aspects that's found there, as we have this called up eventually, bear with me. Again, I'm just glad I have the internet. It's moving a little slowly, but we're getting there. Bear with it. One of the key aspects is within the monastery have been preserved many of the, it says wait, yeah, we're going to wait, have been many of the artworks. And one of these, if I can get this to work, here we go, are the icons, the images. And this one is on wood. This was found in St. Catherine's. And it is an image of Christ that's going to start being preserved and very common. The hand raised here with the two fingers uplifted, holding the word of God, the halo behind him, and then the image of Christ as not the younger man that we saw in the Ravenna mosaic, but an older individual, bearded. this becomes a very traditional image from the Middle East, because in the Middle East, where St. Catherine's is, it's in Egypt, this image of Christ, the image of a man having a beard, was very common. Men typically had beards in that region. So this becomes a common image used in this region that's eventually going to influence the depictions of Christ elsewhere. And it's an interesting aspect. This image of Christ's hand raised here, as you can see here, is going to be an image that's going to be seen later. Da Vinci uses it. So it becomes sort of this iconic style of how Christ is to be shown, looking directly at the viewer, clothed in robe, typically the royal purple, the hand raised, holding the Bible, the jeweled codex, the blessing. That's what this hand is. He is conveying a blessing, and he's holding the word of God. And that becomes a very typical, what we now would call an iconic image of Christ. And much of it traces back to what we see in St. Catherine's monastery's depiction. Again, bear with me. So this Byzantine culture, much of what we see in Constantinople, the mosaics, the use of the bright colors, the details that are presented, all are coming in what we would call Byzantine style. The use of the icons that are very typical are all part of this. And I'm moving through, trying to get to the end of this as fast as I can. Since it's slowing down, I'm worried that I'm going to lose internet connection in just a moment. Bear with us. Again, this idea of these images, part of it, Constantinople images are going to be maintained in the sense of Russia. I mentioned about the codex being under the control of the czars of Russia for quite some time, then sold by the Soviet Union to the British Museum. Russia had trade with this region. When the Ottomans take over, the Turks, as I mentioned here, they're falling in 1453. The Russian emissaries still maintain trade with them, and you have the Orthodox Church in Russia established, one of the major ones, and they maintain not only the sense of the teachings of the church, but also the architecture and art styles. And you're going to see that in a number of different areas when we get around to talking about Russia later. Now, of course, in the early 20th century, when the Bolshevik Revolution takes place and eventually the communists take over, because communism does not advocate religion in the sense of any Christian views or other religious. It's atheistic in its approach. The churches were forbidden, and much of the art was either sold. It says 1933 they sold the codex. Others were sold or were just simply put away. Meanwhile, in Italy, and I'm reaching the end here, you have a development also is taking place. Some of this is the Constantine and Justinian influence, where you're going to have this Byzantine art as part of it. When the Crusades, and we'll get to those later, take place, they bring back more of this, so that when we get to the 11th, 12th, 13th century, you're going to start having some of the influence of the Middle East, and the idea of the Byzantine influence is going to be seen on the art also in Italy. And again, as we're trying to reach the end here, bear with us. As it says in your book, the Byzantine arts become more and more important during this time. They set up shops. It's going to be later. We'll cover those as we get later. This is what we call Byzantine art. This idea about the theology is part of it. There's a religious sense to it. There's going to be a sense of brightness of color and ornamentation as part of it. As it says here, modern scholars who went to St. Catherine's monastery, they found some of these traditions and details. When Father Demetrios died in 1958, he was really one who kept up that style of painting and had maintained it. And so you have, he was really sort of the last great artist in this style. And again, bear with us as we're trying to move through this. We are getting very close to the end of the chapter, and I'm trying to get there so we can end on time. Again, just bear with us with patience. You have other aspects. It says the theological aspects, philosophies are part of this. You have influence of the Greeks on the teachings there as well. Justinian pushing the religious attitude, Christianity. You have pagan academies are closed by Justinian, but his successors reopened those, allowing theological studies and humanistic thought. Aristotle's teaching become part of it. We're going to see the rise of the Platonic schools during the same era. You're going to have other teachers come along. Again, much of it where you have the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. You're going to have many of the Greek scholars leaving that area and going to Italy, to other areas, to Europe, the other European nations, and they bring with them this tradition of teaching that's going to influence what occurs later. And that's going to help inspire what we're calling the Renaissance. When these teachings start taking place, 11, 12, 1300s, and then especially that big wave in the 1400s, we're going to start seeing the real flowering of new thought and new ideas and attitudes that the Renaissance is going to capture. And now we are here at the end of the chapter. Again, reviewing some of the key points that you see here and the details that are offered will give you an idea of what we see. And so I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. And we'll try that again. There we go. Again, thank you three for showing up. I'm going to get this taken uploaded eventually. Again, you have a reading quiz over chapters 6 and 7 due by Sunday evening. Next week, hopefully, we're going to have better weather. Everything will be working properly. And so we will meet again with Zoom on Monday. And we will be covering next week chapter 8. It's all about chapter 8 covers one of the other rising religions, the Islamic faith. And we'll be talking about that as we get ready to have our second exam. So again, thank you for showing up. Stay safe, stay warm. I hope everything is going well for you.